Have you ever walked into a room and instantly felt like someone had already made up their mind about you? You hadn't introduced yourself. You hadn't said a single word, yet somehow, their eyes lingered for just a moment, their expression shifted, and in that silent exchange, it felt as if they had already decided who you were. Confident, awkward, friendly, arrogant, smart, untrustworthy, all before you even had the chance to speak. Here's the unsettling part. They probably weren't trying to judge you, their brain simply did it automatically. And so does yours. Every single day, your brain makes thousands of decisions without asking for your permission. Most of them are harmless. Which route to take? Which face looks familiar? Whether a sound is dangerous? But one of its fastest decisions is deciding what kind of person someone is, and it happens in seconds. Sometimes in less time than it takes to blink. The strange question is, why? How can a human brain confidently judge another human without knowing anything about them? Imagine this. You arrive at a job interview. Another candidate walks in. They're wearing a perfectly tailored suit. They walk calmly. Their posture is straight. They smile briefly at the receptionist. You haven't spoken to them. You don't know their qualifications. You don't know if they're kind or dishonest or even good at the job. Yet somewhere inside your mind, a quiet voice whispers, they probably know what they're doing. Where did that voice come from? Because it certainly wasn't based on evidence. Now imagine the opposite. Someone enters the same room looking nervous. Their shoulders are tense. They avoid eye contact. They fumble with their bag. Before they even sit down, many people unconsciously assume they're less capable. Not because they are, but because their appearance has already become a story inside someone else's mind. And that's the frightening thing about first impressions. They don't just describe reality, they create it. Think back to school. There was probably one student everyone believed was the smart one. Another was labeled the troublemaker. Someone else became the quiet kid. What's fascinating is, once those labels appeared, people started noticing only the behaviors that confirmed them. The smart student made one mistake. Nobody cared. The troublemaker behaved perfectly for a week. People still expected trouble. The quiet student had brilliant ideas. Most never heard them. It's almost as if the first judgment became stronger than reality itself. But why would our minds work this way? Why would evolution give us a brain that prefers quick conclusions over accurate ones? Because thousands of years ago, being wrong about someone's personality was often safer than being too slow to decide. And that ancient survival shortcut is still running inside your modern brain today. What if I told you that people aren't just judging you before you speak? You're also quietly judging yourself based on the way you believe others see you. And once that cycle begins, it can completely change the person you become. Not because your personality changed, but because someone else's first impression slowly became your identity. So how does the brain create an entire story from just a single glance? And more importantly, can anyone ever escape a first impression? Because the answer is far more unsettling than most people realize. Long before humans built cities, before language became sophisticated, before names, resumes, or social media profiles, your ancestors had only one thing to rely on, a quick impression. Because in the wild, hesitation could be fatal. Imagine standing alone in an unfamiliar landscape. Someone appears in the distance. You don't have 10 minutes to learn who they are. You have seconds. Are they a friend or a threat? Do they belong to your tribe or someone else's? Can you trust them? Or should you run? Waiting for more information wasn't always an option. Sometimes, the people who survived weren't the ones who made the most accurate decisions. They were the ones who made decisions the fastest, and your brain still carries that ancient survival system today. Your brain doesn't actually see a person first, it sees patterns. A confident walk, a tired face, a loud laugh, expensive clothes, a hesitant handshake, tiny fragments of information, then almost instantly, it stitches those fragments into a complete story. As if it were finishing a puzzle, with most of the pieces still missing. The strange part? That story feels true, even when it's built on almost no evidence. Psychologists have a name for this remarkable ability. It's called thin slicing. The brain takes an incredibly small slice of information, sometimes just a few seconds, and uses it to predict someone's personality, intentions, or competence. And surprisingly, research has shown that these rapid judgments can sometimes contain a grain of truth, but only sometimes, because the same shortcut that helps us navigate the world can also mislead us. A calm voice might sound intelligent. A nervous pause might be mistaken for dishonesty. Someone attractive may appear more trustworthy, not because they are, but because your brain quietly fills in the blanks. It prefers a complete story over an incomplete one. Think about the last time you met someone. Maybe it was at work, a cafe, a party, or even while scrolling through a profile online. Within moments, you probably had a feeling about them, not a fact, a feeling. And without realizing it, your brain immediately began searching for evidence to support that feeling. If they smiled, you noticed. If they made one awkward comment, you remembered it. Everything that matched your first impression stood out. Everything that contradicted it quietly faded into the background, almost as if your brain wasn't trying to discover the truth. It was trying to protect the story it had already written. This creates an uncomfortable question. If everyone is constantly writing stories about strangers, how many of those stories are completely wrong? Probably more than we'd like to admit. The shy person may simply be exhausted. The confident person may be deeply insecure. The quiet person may have the most fascinating ideas in the room. The person who seemed cold might just be terrified of being rejected first. Yet our brains rarely pause to consider these possibilities, because certainty feels safer than uncertainty, even when that certainty is an illusion. And here's where this becomes deeply personal. Think about how many opportunities begin with a first impression. A job interview, a first date, a classroom, a business meeting, a friendship. Sometimes, people don't respond to who you really are. They respond to the story their brain created about you, before you ever had the chance to tell your own. And once that story takes hold, something even more powerful begins to happen, because first impressions don't just change how others see you. They can quietly change how you start behaving. Without realizing it, you begin adapting to the expectations surrounding you. So the biggest question is no longer, why do people judge us so quickly? The real question is, what happens when we start believing those judgments ourselves? Because that is where first impressions stop being opinions and start becoming identities. Imagine meeting someone for the very first time. They seem confident. They speak clearly. They smile at the right moments. Almost instantly, your brain begins filling in the blanks. They're probably intelligent. They're probably successful. They're probably trustworthy. But here's the unsettling truth. None of those conclusions came from evidence. They came from a single impression that quietly spread across everything else you believed about them. Psychologists call this the halo effect. One positive quality creates the illusion of many others. And the opposite happens too. One awkward moment, one nervous laugh, one uncomfortable silence can unfairly color everything that follows. A person isn't just seen as shy. They're suddenly perceived as less capable, less confident, even less interesting. Not because they are, but because the mind prefers consistency over complexity. Think about someone you've known for years. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If they suddenly behaved completely differently tomorrow, would you notice who they've become? Or would you keep seeing who they've always been? Most of us like to believe we're open-minded, that we judge people fairly. But our brains are surprisingly stubborn. Once a story feels true, it begins filtering reality itself. This is known as confirmation bias. Instead of searching for what's true, or the brain quietly searches for what feels familiar. If you believe someone is kind, you'll remember every act of kindness. If you believe they're selfish, the exact same behavior suddenly looks suspicious. Two people can witness the same moment and walk away with completely different conclusions. Not because reality changed, but because the stories inside their minds were already different. Now imagine living inside one of those stories. Imagine hearing over and over again, "You're the quiet one. You're not leadership material. You're awkward. You're difficult." At first, they're just opinions, but something remarkable happens when we hear the same story enough times. We begin adjusting ourselves to fit it. The quiet child speaks less. The problem employee stops volunteering ideas. The student labeled as average gradually stops believing they're capable of being exceptional. Not because those labels were accurate, but because expectations have an extraordinary power. Psychologists call this a self-fulfilling prophecy. When people expect something from you, they often behave in ways that make it more likely to happen. And without realizing it, you start responding to those expectations. Little by little, someone else's first impression begins shaping your future decisions. Until one day, it no longer feels like someone else's opinion. It feels like your identity. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about. This isn't happening only in classrooms or workplaces or relationships. It's happening inside your own mind every morning. When you look in the mirror, you carry invisible stories about yourself. "I'm not charismatic. People don't usually like me. I'm just not that confident." Where did those stories come from? Did you discover them on your own? Or did they quietly grow from years of seeing yourself through other people's eyes? Because sometimes, the most powerful first impression isn't the one someone else makes about you. It's the one you've been repeating to yourself for years. And once that story feels permanent, you stop questioning it. You simply live inside it. But if first impressions can shape who we become, does that mean we're trapped by them forever? Or is there a hidden flaw in the way our brains judge people? Because neuroscience suggests something extraordinary. The brain that creates these instant judgments is also capable of rewriting them. It just doesn't happen the way most people think. If first impressions are so powerful, does that mean we're all trapped by them? Not exactly. Because here's something fascinating about the human brain. The same brain that forms snap judgments is also capable of changing them, but only when something forces it to stop and look again. The problem is that rarely happens on its own. Our brains love efficiency. Once they've created a story, they'd rather defend it than rewrite it. Changing your mind requires effort. Keeping your first impression doesn't. And that's why first impressions can survive, even when reality keeps proving them wrong. Think about someone you completely misunderstood. Maybe you thought they were arrogant until you discovered they were painfully shy. Maybe you assumed someone was unfriendly, only to learn they were grieving the loss of someone they loved. Or perhaps someone once judged you. They thought you weren't smart enough, not experienced enough, not confident enough. Until one conversation on one project or one unexpected moment made them realize how wrong they had been. What changed? Not your personality, their story. And maybe that's the real danger of first impressions. Not that they're always wrong, but that they're often incomplete. They're the opening sentence, not the entire book. Yet we treat them as final conclusions. Imagine trying to understand a movie after watching only the first 30 seconds, or judging a person based on the first 3 seconds. It sounds absurd, yet that's exactly what our brains do. Every single day, there's another uncomfortable truth hiding beneath all of this. We spend so much of our lives trying to control what other people think of us. We choose our clothes carefully. We rehearse conversations in our heads. We worry about saying the wrong thing. We overanalyze awkward moments from years ago, as if there's a perfect version of ourselves that everyone will instantly understand. But there isn't, because people never meet you exactly as you are. They meet you through the lens of their own experiences, their own fears, their own expectations, their own unconscious shortcuts. In other words, their first impression often says as much about their mind as it does about you. That doesn't mean first impressions don't matter, they do. A smile, a calm voice, open body language, kindness, presence. These things shape how people experience us, but they should never become the measure of our worth, because no human being can be accurately understood in a matter of seconds. Not you, not anyone. So perhaps the better question was never, why do people decide who you are before you speak? Maybe the better question is, why are we so quick to believe them? Why do we allow a stranger's first impression to become our inner voice? Why do we let one awkward moment define years of our identity? Because the stories we tell ourselves are often far more powerful than the stories other people tell about us. And unlike their stories, ours are repeated every single day. So the next time you walk into a room, remember this. Someone may decide who you are before you've spoken a single word. You can't completely stop that. It's part of being human. But you do have a choice. You can decide whether their first impression becomes your final identity. Because every first impression is only a guess, and no guess, no matter how confident it seems, has the right to define an entire human being. The most important version of you has never existed in someone else's first impression. It has always existed, or just beyond it.